You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 270 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm going to be discussing Armistice Day or Veterans Day, and then the other big news issue of the day, which is the war going on in Yemen and the new development of the U.S. cutting mid-air refueling to Saudi Arabia. I think this will be a good show to share. I got a lot of interesting stuff to say, I think, so foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, or go and check out the Libertarian Institute. You can find this show and my daily news roundup on the homepage there. And the URL there is libertarianinstitute.org. And then the last place I'll send you, minds.com. This is a new social networking site. I have a page there at Immersion News. So you check that out. I'm posting a lot of content there. I'm trying to start like a anti-war community there on Minds and putting up a lot of good stuff. It's a much better, I think, site and platform than Facebook. At this point, when you're looking at censorship and, you know, kind of getting the stuff in your feed that you actually want to see. Facebook has been annoying me lately. If I don't get on there enough, I start getting more and more notifications of things that I've already seen. And so it's just, you know, completely insane to continue down the Facebook path. I'm definitely trying to shift more of what I'm doing on the social networks to Minds. And so everybody, think about checking that out. If you haven't created an account, maybe you could do that, minds.com/immersion news. All right. Armistice Day. You know, this is supposed to be the day celebrating the end of World War I. World War I was a terrible, terrible war. And not that all war isn't terrible, and I don't know how, you know, you would necessarily compare, to, you know, what's gone on in the terror wars as to, or like the war in Yemen as to some of the, you know, more gruesome battles in World War I. But this is a war where, you know, it's 1914, so there's, you know, not a lot of great medical equipment. There's just not a lot of wealth in the world overall. And so it's not like you could give, you know, troops like emergency medevats out all the time. And, you know, probably a lot of people are developing infections and they're getting amputations where that just wouldn't happen today. There's gas going on. And I guess gas is used a little bit in warfare today, but not like the extent that was used during World War I. Trench warfare, which was absolutely disastrous. And, you know, this came down to the point where you would actually have, you know, commanders forcing their troops to run out there, even if it meant running into machine gun fire, or they would shoot them themselves. So, just an absolutely brutal and awful war. And at the end of it, you know, rather than celebrating it as Victory Day or anything like that, Armistice Day, Peace Day, the war is over. The war in Europe is over. The war to end all wars is over. At some point, if there's interest from the audience, I could have somebody who's a historian on to really discuss more about World War I and, you know, even like World War II, Korean War, and Vietnam are things that, you know, I'm expert on just because I haven't lived through that kind of stuff. And so if you're real interested in having, you know, a true expert on the show, you just message me that and I could look for somebody to have on about those subjects. But I think the really interesting thing and really important to, you know, kind of what we have going on today when we're trying to do things like end the war in Yemen or in Afghanistan or Iraq is that the U.S. has really shifted this celebration. Rather than it be a celebration of ending war, it's a celebration of our veterans. Now, this at first sounds like, you know, oh man, Kyle must be a real jerk because he thinks celebrating veterans is a terrible thing. But that's not as much what happens actually on Veterans Day. We celebrate what they do. So we say that, you know, oh man, you know, what you're doing is amazing. You're out there protecting our freedoms. Without you, we would all be slaves to the jihadists. You know, it would be like living in Saudi Arabia in this country, a country that our military actually defends, if we, you know, for whatever reason, didn't value our troops enough. So thank God we have these people in, you know, the missions they do to keep us safe. And, you know, when you do listen to like the football game and stuff, they talk about, you know, making donations, you know, to the USO or to the Wounded Warrior Project, things that actually I'm sure do help veterans and, people who have sustained injuries that they just shouldn't have sustained. Like, they should have never been over there fighting in the first place. And so now, the PTSD or, missing limbs or other kinds of burns and injuries are things that these people and their families have to live with. And, they need some help sometimes to do that. And so the Wounded Warrior Project and all these other groups are I'm sure, helpful with that. Now, it is amazing to me that you have this group of veterans who, kind of collectively, we all decided need to go overseas. And, one thing about wounded veterans and just like the VA that always amazes me is that you have this group of, it's really a handful of Americans. I know it's a few million, but if you think of a country at 300 or so million now, that, if we decide to send these people overseas and put them in harm's way, and, the slogan is always to defend our freedoms or make the world safe for us or other people, that we would actually be able to provide these people with, the services they need, from the lasting injuries from what, they faced overseas. And the fact that people, can never get that together, I think just shows, that, I really don't think it's a logistical problem. Not that I think the U.S. government or any government really would be a good, vehicle to provide healthcare to millions of people. But if you just, look at the billions of dollars that the U.S. government spent, the fact that they can't take, whatever small portion that they need and run an effective healthcare system for a few million people, it seems absolutely absurd, especially since, they pretend that these are, the most vulnerable and, deserving of help, of all the Americans. The fact that they can't provide this to the people makes me think that, it's really more of a lack of effort from trying than, just being a service that the government is completely unable to provide. But back on to the kind of the main focus here of, how the celebration, the vets works. Most of it, is celebrating what they do, which means we're celebrating the missions, which means we're kind of saying that it's a great thing that the U.S. soldiers over in Iraq and Afghanistan. And, this isn't just from where you would think like the deep red states, that really place high value on joining the military and where most of the young men who go and fight overseas come from. But this is even true of just like liberal Democrats. I mentioned on the last show, the Pod Save American guys going, well, better to send these guys overseas than to the southern border. One thing I see a lot on Facebook, and, this is probably, and Twitter, in part because, I stay within an anti-war circle, but there's a lot of vets on there who say, if you really want to thank veterans for their service, look at, kind of the situations that you're putting them in overseas. I think a great example is what the deployment of U.S. troops, and I believe they're still there outside of Manbij, Syria, where they drive around in Humvees with big American flags on the back and sometimes take enemy fire. And what they're doing is they're driving around in between the battle lines of the U.S. allied Kurds and the U.S. NATO allied Turkey's bad forces that sometimes include Al-Qaeda guys. There in northern Syria. And so the fact that, we're actually using our soldiers as kind of, kind of peacekeepers that are there to keep our allies from shooting at each other is just such an insane position. And if we really want to celebrate veterans, it seems to me that the first thing we would do is start, looking at the places where U.S. veterans our U.S. soldiers, are deployed overseas and, start to, figure out places where they don't need to be. Do we need U.S. troops in the Helmand province of Afghanistan? That's never going to be controlled by anybody other than the Taliban. So let's get our troops off that pointless mission and bring them home. But these aren't the discussions that you're going to hear in most places. It's just going to be, how great the mission is and how they protected our freedoms, and never about, what they're doing there. Another thing, and one of the reasons why I don't think the midterm elections are going to be very impacting on the U.S. foreign policy is if you look at a situation like Niger, where you have 4 U.S. service members die about a year ago. Lindsey Graham, who is a hawk and on the Foreign Relations Committee, says, hey, I didn't even know that those troops were there, kind of as a way to, shirk his responsibility, which he should have had for those troops dying. But, it's quite the terrible situation. And I think shows, what little respect Congress has actually for our troops, that they're always willing to, stand on their graves and talk about how we need to continue the mission that they died fighting for. That they're not even going to take the time to look at all the troops deployments in places where U.S. troops could die. I mean, that's their responsibility, the war-making powers, and they're just completely ignoring them. So I'm sure the takeaway from most people today, especially Americans who will spend their Sunday, maybe morning at church or a family dinner tonight, but have, football, or I'm going to be watching NASCAR later on. It's all going to be about, celebrating the troops and their missions, defending our freedoms, and never, questioning if they should really be over there. All right, Yemen. So not that long ago, I was on the Peace and Liberty podcast, and I was talking about Yemen. And at the end of the thing, Stephen Clyde, the host there, asked me what I thought people could do. And I said, start calling your senators and congressmen, because I think we're, real close to starting to see some movement here. And we did get the announcement that the U.S. is going to end support by ending the mid-air refueling to Saudi Arabia's planes as they go and bomb Yemen. Now, this seems like a real victory to me. As I've been talking about it, throughout the history of the show, it seemed that the case was that without the U.S. help actually refueling these airplanes, they wouldn't be able to make it to their targets. And by ending the mid-air refueling, it would severely limit and possibly even force Saudi Arabia to stop their bombing campaign against Yemen. Now, this has been a 3-year-long process. And, those in the anti-war community have been calling on this for 3 years, and it's been floated in Congress several times. And so I guess during this time, Saudi Arabia has been developing their own mid-air refueling systems. And I'm not quite sure if that means they, bought U.S.-made planes, or, from another country and have like kind of the traditional, big tanker mid-air refueling systems, or, they're finding another way to do it. But the Pentagon, a source said that, the reason the U.S. is ending this mid-air refueling isn't because they want to end the Saudi bombing of Yemen, but because the Saudis can now do it on their own. If this is true, that, Saudi Arabia is able to, do this themselves, I guess for the Americans, it may be a way to try to keep most of the support for Saudi Arabia. And it seems the focus of the Trump administration is to maintain the weapon sales, while at the same time, try to create a situation to ease the pressure, in some ways coming from Congress to end, the U.S. involvement and support for the Saudi war in Yemen here. And so I think it's important to keep up the pressure. I think if, this doesn't have the result that I was anticipating, which would have been, an end to the Saudi bombing, campaign of Yemen, because they have, their own technology to do it now, then, we gotta keep up that pressure, because there's plenty of other things that the U.S. is doing that's absolutely critical to the Saudi war. At the same time, the U.S. could be, we did have the ceasefire demand, from Mattis at the end of October, that, just a few days before the midterm elections. And now after we have the U.S. making this announcement. And so, it could be just like kind of a logistical shift. The Saudis could do it themselves now. And so the Americans aren't going to help out with it. Or it could be the U.S. really trying to make serious on this agreement, of having a ceasefire in Yemen. If there is a ceasefire to happen in Yemen, one of the things that the U.S. is going to have to pressure the Saudis and the Emiratis to accept is free passage and safe passage for a Houthi delegation to leave Yemen and travel somewhere else in order to have these ceasefire talks. And, people may think, well, that's a pretty low bar. It seems like that's, gonna easily happen. But in the past, Saudi Arabia hasn't allowed it. And at one time, I think they actually allowed the Yemeni party to travel and then didn't allow them to return for several months. So, we're dealing with really like kind of first order situations here as far as the peace talk goes, which is just logistically getting the parties together, like figuring out how the travel is going to work so that everybody feels like they could safely all get it together in a room and have a conversation. So it's really hard to say how close we are potentially to a ceasefire or an end of hostilities here. I think if the Americans really want to pressure Saudi Arabia, and we could even do this at the UN, or simply stop vetoing Russian resolutions against what Saudi Arabia is doing in Yemen. And, really end the blockade of the country and start to allow more goods to come in. There's other ways for the U.S. to really undermine the Saudi effort here and force them to end the war. Another big way would be ending weapons sales, ending the maintenance on the Saudi planes, and then intelligence and logistical targeting support, which again is really critical for the Saudi war there. All right. And there's a great way that, we could force President Trump to end those, and that's by invoking the war powers. That right now there are resolutions in both the House and the Senate that look like they have a decent chance of passing. One is H-Con Res 138. The other is SJ Res 54. Both introduced bipartisan. You have some pretty high-ranking members in the House, and then the Freedom Caucus, Democratic members of the House, and then the Freedom Caucus there. In the Senate, less high-ranking members, but you have like Bernie Sanders, Chris Murphy, and Mike Lee all supporting the resolution. We need to maybe get on Rand Paul a little bit and get him on board for that. But there's a great episode of the Scott Horton show where he has on somebody who's really making the push to the congressman for this. So I'm going to link to that episode in the show notes page. I don't think you're going to learn too much new about like the actual what's going on the Yemen war from that show. But if you want to hear about kind of the politics and the push going on to, end that, at least the U.S. involvement in that war, you could hear it there. One other thing I did want to mention is that on the past two shows, I've really been pretty pessimistic about what the midterm elections would mean. Daniel Larison takes a little bit of a, I think, brighter outlook than myself. And so I just wanted to bring it up that he believes that actually the Dems taking back the House could mean that we actually, it could be the factor in pushing through this Yemen war powers resolution and potentially hearings on the the U.S. role in the Yemen war. I'm not so convinced that, the Democrats are going to be any better than the Republicans were after Benghazi and going after any real scandals. And my guess would be is that they, more target like Trump's text message or Twitter or potentially maybe some financial things going on within the, Trump administration, which are probably illegal. But at the same time, very rarely do any politicians go after any war crimes to their so-called enemies. Last year, I want to talk about the battle for Hadada, which is going on right now. There's an article in Moon of Alabama that I'll link to, which gives some pretty good details on what's going on. But basically what's happened is that the Saudi-backed coalition has surrounded most of the city. There's only one Houthi supply line left going into the city, and I guess is a pretty dangerous route, especially, with the air campaign and the Houthis having no air force whatsoever. And it's now the Houthi strategy, basically the way they're trying to save the city is by trying to cut the supply lines from south of the city, going up the coast there. There's some highland areas, not too far away from the flatlands of the coast, and so I guess they could kind of, make ambush style attacks and try to really disrupt the supply lines. At least as far as I've been observing, this is the most progress that the Saudi UAE coalition has made in trying to take the port of Hadada from the Houthis. And, the problem is that if they do, there's 20 million people that live under the control of the Houthis. And if this port gets cut, it looks like no more food, fuel, or aid, medicine is really going to be getting up to the Houthi territories. And, this could mean, I guess, either starvation or compliance. And just real quick tangent, I just wanted to bring it up. Mike Pompeo seems to have, the old Madeleine Albright U.S. Secretary of State spirit, saying that if the Iranian government, they need to comply with the U.S. On these sanctions and on what we want from them, or else their people won't eat. And so, he's talking about starvation of the Iranians. Now, I don't think the situation is probably the same, and that Iran is probably going to have a little bit more international support there to that their citizens won't be starving. I don't think it's quite as poor of a nation as like Yemen or Iraq in the 1990s. However, this is the point of the sanctions. This is the point of the blockade, is that they're going to, starve people into submission. It's just such an ugly and really immoral tactic to use. So I actually really hate Facebook because I never have good exchanges with people on there. Typically, everybody always assumes you're trying to be, a jerk, and it immediately gets pretty rude back at you, even when you're really not trying to be. But I had a good interaction with somebody this morning, and it seems that there's really this common narrative out there that I wouldn't have suspected, that the reason we're fighting the Houthis is because they're jihadists. Now, the Houthis are not jihadists. The formation of their militia and military movement is after 9/11. The Bush administration starts backing the dictator of Yemen at that time, which is Ali Abdullah Saleh. And he took those weapons and those guns and didn't necessarily fight against the jihadists in the country who later became AQAP, but rather used them, I think, in a couple ways. One, to pit the Muslim Brotherhood against the Houthis, and also just to take the Yemeni army and directly attack. The Houthis controlled like a pretty, I think, rural and elevated area of Yemen, and were able to use kind of mountainous guerrilla tactics to pretty well defend their homeland, and won 4 or 5 short, I think, ill-defined civil wars against the Saleh government. After the, revolution there, Arab Spring came in 2011, and the U.S. facilitated the ascent to power of Mansour Hadi. The Houthis were put in a position where the Hadi government was working to install kind of a new form or system of government in Yemen that was really going to kind of isolate the Houthis, and they were getting the raw end of the deal there. And so rather than simply take Hadi as the new dictator of Yemen, and for him to give away a lot of their wealth and land, I believe, in rule, fought a war against the government and actually took the capital city and a lot of the rest of Yemen. Along the way, they have made other allies in Yemen. I'm sure this is in part driven by the air campaign of Saudi Arabia, where they just, ruthlessly bombed civilians in Yemen, and with the Houthis being their resistance to Saudi Arabia, the reason they jumped on board. It's also important to note that Saudi Arabia, started attacking the Houthis in Yemen before the Houthis started attacking Saudi Arabia. People like to point out the fact that the Houthis need to stop attacking Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia was indiscriminately bombing Yemen far before the Houthis were carrying out any missile attacks against Saudi or Emirati ships in the Red Sea, or against, the Saudi air base along the west coast of Saudi Arabia, or even the Riyadh airport. It's also worth noting that if you look at it, the Houthi weapons are a whole lot less effective and good at killing people than the Saudi bombs are. The Houthis really don't have an air force or any kind of air defense whatsoever. And so the Saudis could just hover over their cities all day, and if they want to blow up a school bus or a funeral hall, there's absolutely nothing the Houthis could do about it. The Saudis have U.S. air defense systems, and the Houthis' missile capabilities are pretty limited. They're just using converted Scud missiles. And so I think it's pretty easy to see when you look at the actual timeline, the Houthi movement isn't necessarily ideological, but more just political for the region. They were picked on, they were suppressed, and so then they ended up fighting back. I think a good question and objection somebody brought up is that the Houthi slogan is something like, death to America, death to Israel. And, I do see why that's problematic, and I'm not, in any way endorsing that slogan, but I think it's more political, than it is ideological. I don't think that the Houthis actually believe that they need to kill the United States of America, but when they look at the bombs that are dropped on their country and the planes that bring those bombs, they're all American made. And so the U.S. certainly has a huge role in the bombing of Yemen. And if you talk to kind of people and see the people of Yemen speak out either on Twitter or whenever a, Western journalist is able to get in the country, they say, this is an American war. And so I think it's pretty clear that the Houthis are not terrorists. I haven't seen really any reports of them carrying out suicide bombings, especially not against civilian targets. There is some civilian targeting of civilian targets with their missiles, but when you look at it, their civilians have been targeted with bombs first and far more often. And so, while it's not okay and definitely isn't justifiable, it's far different than an unprovoked terrorist attack. So anyways, I thought that was kind of a good exchange, and I had a chance to use some of this, massive amount of reading I've done on Yemen over the years to, actually good use on Facebook. So I definitely enjoyed it, but I just thought it was, something I can answer here on the show as well. last thing I'll mention before I wrap up is that the Congo now has this largest Ebola outbreak in history. I believe this is about the 10th one. Over 300 people have been affected. You know, the reason this one is so serious and such a problem is there's like rebel groups feuding in these zones, and I'm not sure if it's just that they really don't care about human life or they don't understand the potential outbreak and the problems with that. But they've even, have fought and raided, I believe, some Ebola treatment centers and like taken somebody out of one. So this is really a crazy thing going on and crazy dangerous. I'm not necessarily sure what anybody could actually do about it other than, whoever has, pressure, in the Congo to, tell these people to knock off the fighting, at least wait a couple months, let this outbreak subside, and then they could go back at it. But this is a reason why war is so dangerous and, why we should, be looking at Amnesty Day, a day, to remember peace and a day to strive for, ending wars rather than, a day like what the U.S. celebrates as Veterans Day, a day to celebrate the mission of defending our freedom, even when it's only made us less free. So I think that's all I got for today. forwardpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. Immersionnews.com is my news website. The Libertarian Institute is a great place to find all my work. And then minds.com/immersionnews. Check it out. And then my anti-war group on there, Anti-War Minds. I think you'll enjoy all that stuff. And thanks everybody. Keep listening.